Very much appreciated. It's been my pleasure to meet everybody here. You have a wonderful community, and sorry at the beginning for our late start and tech problems, but we're off to a good start now. And how I would love for us to do this over the session is feel free just to interrupt, to ask questions, to interject comments, a few amens or whatever you might want to say. So I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what I'm hoping that we'll talk about over the next hour and a half. So first I want to start with having you think about your kind of traditional models, to rethink traditional models of how we understand them in higher education. That is part of some of the work that I do, and to offer up some different metaphors and ways to think about what the change process is itself. So I want to start there. And then I want to spend a good majority of our time thinking about how can we, because all of you are change agents, can be change agents in your setting, and what are some of the kind of effective strategies that you can lever to make changes. And my hope is that you'll leave thinking slightly differently about some new strategies or approaches that you can integrate into the work that you do of change. And for many people, part of a challenge is getting things off the ground often. So I want to talk about that beginning part, which is understanding buy-in and like how do you start the process moving. And sometimes even when you're in a change process and you think you had buy-in and later you find out you don't, buy-in is kind of one of those constant challenges. So I just want to talk about some of the key strategies that I've learned in my research and some of the research from some of the other fields that will maybe be helpful for that part. And then again, I say questions here, but throughout, please feel free to ask any questions that you have. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of why I do this work, and I think it goes back to my own efforts. As I was working in student affairs first, and worked also in academic affairs on college campuses, and I found myself really wrestling with how to be a change agent. And then I went to graduate school and got really excited about hearing both the critiques that were offered of higher education, how we weren't as inclusive as we maybe aspire to be. And we did not do well with many different student populations, and that we weren't using many of the effective strategies around teaching and learning that existed. So as I started to unpack some of that and learn, though, about the many other good things we could be doing, how we could improve, it made me, it started that journey to want to work with the higher education community to integrate those kinds of changes. And I've worked deeply on many of these areas themselves. But it also made me really passionate about understanding the change process, because when I went to look, I'm like, so why aren't we, integrating those lessons about how to create more inclusive and diverse campuses? Then I came across the fact that there really was no research that had been done in higher education about how to create change, and so there weren't really good roadmaps. And so, as Amina was saying, I wanted to try to help contribute to some roadmaps so that people like me who were frustrated change agents could overcome that frustration and feel more efficacious in the work. So that is, I think kind of as many of you in the room, I think we have a shared common interest. Because the work of change, though, is a little hard, I always like to start with a little comedy. So implementing these changes won't be easy. We're pretty set in doing things the wrong way. And that's often how it feels on our campuses. Like we're used to our routines, we're used to our status quo. And so even though people get excited about doing, they see like these visions of new ways we could be doing things, sometimes we just don't embrace it, and this is kind of sometimes the underlying assumption. So change. When we think about change, it tends to be in this very linear way, and it's built often upon kind of the strategic planning. Has anybody in here been in a strategic planning process? Let's see. Yes. So I've never been on a campus or a unit or whatever that hasn't been involved with strategic planning. And it's kind of a linear process as either through that process you identify a set of problems, or you identify a vision of where you want to go forward, and then you generate a course of action, right? So you say this is how we're going to do it, and line up some resources, and then we implement, and then we evaluate, and then if you're like most of the institutions I've been at, we started all over again, and we never met the goals of the last strategic plan that we had. And it's kind of in this very linear and lockstep process. But what I found both in my research in higher education in particular, but there's also the broad-based literature outside of higher education, demonstrates that strategic planning alone pretty much doesn't usually lead to change, and particularly more transformational kinds of changes. It is not. It's alone, again, so it's not that strategic planning itself is a bad thing. It's a very good thing. But alone, it is unlikely to lead to change. So since we're so dependent on it, so part of what I'm often talking to people about is how do you think differently about change from it being strategic planning, because that is our routine when we think about change in higher education. That's what we think about. I'll call it's overly rational and only attentive to kind of structure and processes, like let's allocate these resources and deploy these people. So it has this mentality, and it doesn't really look at the political or relational aspects that are important to change processes. So it really narrowly defines the scope of the kinds of things that you should be doing to create change. And all of the research, again, that I've done inside higher ed or outside suggests that it's a much more complex process. And so part of this is just starting to understand change as a different phenomenon. If you're going to be an effective change agent, you can't think of strategic planning is change. That won't get you there. So this is a fun picture, but I want you to kind of move from that linear model to something that's much more dynamic when you start to think about change. But this is a river metaphor. So this came out of a study that I did with a set of 8 campuses where we said, go out, engage in a change process, and come back and tell us about, so it was in a sense kind of phenomenological. What was the change process like for you? How would you describe it? And as we went across all of these different institutions and their experiences, they came up with this river metaphor. So I'll give you as if you want to replace the metaphor of kind of this linear strategic planning with this idea of the river, it might be a helpful metaphor. What they described for me and the rest of the research team was, like a river, the change process was not one where we just went from point A to point B. It was meandering, like a river can be. And sometimes we were flowing. Sometimes things, were going along well. But other times we would hit some, rapids, and things would get shaky, or we'd hit some rocks, and that would be some of the barriers. So they're describing you have to anticipate. It can't feel like this lockstep, smooth process. You're going to hit rapids, and you're going to hit rocks, and you have to be prepared that along the way there are obstacles and setbacks. And sometimes they said, you hit a spot so bad that you're going to pull your boat out of the water, and you're going to think for a while about your process and not keep going down the river, because you're realizing that it's you are likely to maybe have your boat get blown up against the rocks, and pulling it out for a second is probably a better idea. And then they said sometimes you get in an eddy where it feels like you're going in circles and you're not moving anywhere, and that's a natural part of the process too. Sometimes you hit some points of inertia, and then you can take your oar out and push off against the shore and get out of the eddy again. And then there are moments where, again, you start flowing down the river. And they talked about how, so you establish the vision, up front there again, but you're going to be revisiting that vision along the way. And so these processes, while things would be happening along the way, you revisit vision and you revisit your strategies. And so that's why the circles, they always had these sort of constant circles in the middle of some of these processes, because it feels like you're wrapping up and going through each of them sort of time and again. So as just this is just a kind of visual metaphor for you to kind of rethink maybe how when you think about the change process and you're as a change agent, how you're going to be thinking forward about what the process might look like. So I'm going to talk to you to kind of give this a little tangibility throughout the talk about a specific example at my own campus, and one of the changes that we were trying to engage in, which was better support for faculty who are off the tenure track. And how this started is there were a series of adjunct faculty and some of our full-time non-tenure track faculty, and they started having conversations about their concerns, that they were excluded from professional development and they really felt that they couldn't offer, as good of a classroom experience when they were both not able to get professional development, but they also were excluded from meetings. So then there would be conversations about curriculum and syllabus changes, and they weren't a part of those, and so it made it really challenging for them. They were also just talking about, the challenge each semester to get, say, parking passes. So they were late for their own classes, or so it was from the most logistical, basic kind of thing, up through some really meaningful things about how they were trying to shape the teaching and learning environment. And so they, asked to create a subcommittee of the academic senate. So we have a senate, and at that time there was no non-tenure track faculty on it. By the way, two or 3 years ago, we had our first non-tenure track faculty that chaired our academic senate. So things are changing. So this was back in time, but they were not on the academic senate and didn't have seats, and so they wanted to create a subcommittee that could do some work to support the adjunct faculty. Well, that was denied. So that was their first hitting of the rocks, if you will. And what they found out, they were sussing around saying, why wouldn't we be able to create this academic subcommittee? What's going on? So they found out that there was a lot of tension, that people thought they were trying to create a shadow and other sort of senate that would be of the sort of the adjunct faculty, and they were really worried of creating sort of this division. So they found out about this, and then they both went and they had strategized and tried to get, so they knew that the same person that had asked in the first place may not be the best person going forward. So they got a new person who was going to head this initiative, and they went in with a different charge and didn't say that the charge looked less threatening. They also heard that the charge was threatening, and then that request was accepted. So they were starting to flow down the river again. So they had to find out about what were the concerns of the Senate to move around them. Then they conducted a survey of the needs. So they were trying to understand better, if we're going to make some changes to policies and practices, how do we understand better? Because the adjunct faculty that were on this group said we can't possibly represent all the different voices and experiences. So let's find out what is going on. So then they got the data back, but there were really different views of the data by each school and department. So people couldn't argue about what were really the concerns. So there was all this debate among themselves. And so, as I said, the progress slowed, and they sort of went into this eddy while they were waiting and trying to figure out okay, we can't come to any consensus or agreement. We've done this great survey. What do we do next? Well, so somebody came up with the idea of let's put together a retreat, and let's really spend some time at that retreat building relationships among people who are there, and kind of have them better understand each other. And at that retreat then, they were able to come to an enormous amount of consensus about the needs, and came up with an agenda and a set of proposed changes. They thought, well, let's get these into the handbook, and it'll make it really systemic, that we can really shape and change the effort for all of the faculty. And as soon as the handbook committee went absolutely crazy when they asked for this change, and it was denied. So then they pulled the raft out of the water because they'd finally spent, they'd spent a year going through doing this survey and coming to consensus around it. I mean, they were really excited, and then just slapped down, like not going forward. Then they went in and they were doing some kind of sussing on their own, like what's going on? Like, why is this being so resisted? And our campus happens to be really decentralized, and so anything coming down from a centralized place is not well received. So they decided instead to move to a policy summit. So they would invite each of the deans and say, oh my God, the School of Social Work, wow, do they do this fantastic professional development for their non-tenure track faculty. And you know what, the School of Journalism, they offer creative breaks for their adjuncts. So they started pulling together all the best policies across each different department and created, there's a lot of competition between our deans at USC, and started sort of getting them to like have this competition about like, wait, they're doing that really great policy or practice. So it created instead like a bottom-up change among the deans who were competing rather than it coming down through the handbook that one must follow this policy or practice. So this was at the point they started shooting down the river where like an explosion then of changes started to happen across each school. And eventually over time, some of this has been implemented into the handbook, although there's a lot of resistance still at our school to any kind of centralized system, but we really have like had a complete overhaul of the policies and practices for our non-tenure track faculty. So just using this as an example to kind of see how stop and start and obstacles and how natural that is as a part of a change process. So a lot of what you see in terms of often barriers though, so one of the things that had this group had the benefit of this session that you're having right now, they may have actually hit a few less, they would have hit maybe a few less of those rocks and been able to navigate a little bit better, because some of the things that shaped their process could have been anticipated. So a lot of the times the barriers that you hit have to do with still thinking in less simplistic or more simplistic and less systematic ways to go about change. So these are kind of some of the traditional barriers that, as I talk about the change strategies, they'll help to really overcome. So the lack of buy-in that I mentioned, but also lack of capacity for data collection and analysis in terms of centralized supports for changes, unforeseen political challenges that we just heard about, lack of professional development so people can enact the change, lack of incentives or rewards, policies that get in the way, inadequate resource identification, shifts in upper level leadership. We talked about this earlier today, change in champions because of turnover to other assignments. So these are all kind of some of the oftentimes barriers that come up in change processes, but many of them can be anticipated. So that's what we're going to talk about is, so you know that change is like this meandering river and you're likely to hit some of these barriers, but you want to hit fewer if you can. And to do that, it's really helpful to develop more of a change toolkit. So again, the strategic plan doesn't give you a change toolkit. So I want to offer up something that's going to avoid this in your change process. So one of the really common tools that's used, and I don't know if anybody is familiar with Bowman and Deal's 4 frames, so some of you may be familiar. And often I think it has been used for people to understand their leadership styles and orientations when they're leading an organization, but it is just as easily applicable, and I've done this a lot of my work, to how you think about change. So some of you may be familiar with this as you think about your own leadership. And what I'm going to talk about is linking that as leadership for change, though. How do you think about these frames as we think about leadership? So the 4 frames that I'll describe have been used they've been pulled from organizational theory, and they help describe how organizations operate, like what are the various subsystems within organizations. But they also relate to how people then interact with the organizations themselves. So they can be used if you leverage them to enhance your leadership for change. So you can use these, like you can think about these multiple frames to think about different ways to analyze, to come up with the change itself. Like, how do I analyze our organizations from different perspectives to come up with a vision for change? But it can also be used to develop strategies themselves for change. So it can be used in kind of multiple ways to enact change. And what the goal is two kinds of things, either that you become more of a multi-frame leader is what we'll talk about, or that you work in teams. So the other way to do this is working with other people who may have a different skill set from you. So I'm going to talk about the political frame and the symbolic frame. So let's say you decide that's not one that's your strong suit. That also means that you can think about, how do I team with, as a change agent, how do I ally with and work with other people who might have that skill set. So you don't always have to embody all of these, because some of you might say, I don't know, like that's not something I can see myself doing. But it's also like, how do you then deploy, like to bring in that skill set to a leadership effort that you're working on. So in the end, I'm hoping for your strategy a little bit more like that complex one I showed you, rather than the kind of narrow one for the strategic plan. So the 4 frames that Bowman and Deal talk about are the structural frame that I'll describe, the human relations frame, the political or advocacy. I've renamed it advocacy, that's not their name, I'll talk to you about why, and then the symbolic frame. So these are the 4 frames. So the structural frame, and many of you, you may see yourself in this, is you're the person who kind of, when you first kind of walk into, if you go to a new campus, you walk in and you're thinking, I want to know like who reports to who, like as you're thinking about, you know, understanding the campus, and who does what, and what are they trying to do, what are their goals, and what, you know, so that this is the kind of your orientation as you think about a campus, if you kind of walk in and you're trying to understand it. And so you really are thinking a lot about, as we'll call them, the formal structures. And those are things like the roles and rules, goals, policies. You're kind of driven by that being as one of the things that you think is sort of central for the, and this is when, you know, we all have this orientation to think about, like, what makes a place effective when you're walking in, or what do I think is important? And so if you're oriented towards this, these are the kinds of things that you're likely to be first registering, first asking about, first thinking about. And then when you're thinking about like how we're gonna get things done, right, in an organization, you're thinking about, we need to, you know, set goals and plan. We need to think about how we divide out and allocate the different responsibilities. Now you're thinking about who's gonna do what. Are people, is the work divided up in ways that makes the most sense? And you're thinking about, you know, do we need a unit? Like what is this department doing? So you're oriented towards thinking in that way. As you think about then maybe when it comes time to improve things, structures come first to your mind in terms of ways things can be improved. So you're likely to think that, you know, well, if we make a change in that policy, that's going to make us much more effective in this sphere of area we're trying to do, recruitment, let's say. Like, we need a different policy around recruitment if you think that process isn't going well. So you think that problems originate from inappropriate structures or inadequate systems. And then they can be resolved through, you think about, so the initiative is we need to restructure. So that is the first thing that's to come to your mind. So change leaders in this orientation tend to think about, you know, structures that can support something. So, and this is, you know, really common. So like, I'm gonna just bring up the example of, you know, campuses I work with when they're trying to improve diversity and inclusion on their campuses. The first things, what's the first thing we might do? You tell me, from a structural perspective, what do people do on campuses when they're trying to improve diversity? So we survey and get data about the issue. That is very much a structural solution. What else? Hire somebody, make a center. Like, what campus? I don't know any campus that isn't the first thing that they ran to do when sort of we said it, that this was a priority for higher education, diversity and inclusion. We set up an office we hired some individuals in those roles. We set up goals and plans around it, right? I mean, so as you imagine, and again, the structural is very much fits into a lot of the strategic planning efforts too. So it's very familiar to us. So, in most places I go, this is a familiar lens. People, not everybody's always in agreement this is the most important, but they're very familiar that this is a strategy that's deployed a lot on campuses. So the second frame that Bowman and Deal talk about is the human relations frame. And from this perspective, it's sort of like pull back the veil. Hey, organizations aren't just made of structures, there are people there too. And people are really central, right, to the functioning. So they started to really look at the role of, organizations are only as good as the people that they hire, at how they're trained, how they're socialized, what kind of professional development they get, whether we look at whether the role is a good fit for them, whether we think about opportunities they have for advancement so that they're going to find the work challenging, so they want to keep giving back to it. When you introduce people, then there's going to be dynamics and interpersonal relationships, and those can affect the work that we do and our effectiveness. But it also brings up the issues of, as they've been studies on this area, so like that people, when there's positive morale, organizations are more effective, when people are satisfied. So these kind of things are really important dimensions to our effectiveness as organizations. So these kinds of processes are emphasized within the human relations frame. And so there's much more of this interaction between the role that organizations are only going to be as functional as people feeling that they are, treated well, not exploited within organizations. And so human beings will really give to organizations, and when they find their work meaningful. But if not, it's a two-way street. But so this lens is leaders who are in an organization and they see that problems stem then from the ways that human resources are not deployed well and the development is not there. They also see that change can occur when we're, again, hiring the right people, have appropriate training, offer them professional development to engage in the change. So if we think about that example of diversity and inclusion, what kinds of things either have you done on this campus or you've heard of in higher education that kind of fit in this umbrella of the human relations frame? Training sessions, we do those. Culture surveys. But sort of the impetus of thinking about are people feeling there is a fairness? So like having the concern, like the conversation around, so the place to start would be, because you wouldn't change a policy unless you understood, do people feel we don't have fair processes around promotion, right? So having those conversations as a human relations one, understanding people's, if we went back here, understanding people's needs and concerns, that's a part of this. So that there would have been a precursor before you change the policy. You'd have to know that. Other things.
Diversity ambassadors.
Diversity ambassadors, so they're people who can interact and help people to problem solve and relate around this, yeah. Mentoring is a great example of that. Yeah, I mean, the ways that individuals can get support from mentors and creates a system of support. That's a great example. Yeah, no, that is absolutely important, and important specifically to diversity and inclusion, which is really relational work of people. Down the line, we're going to be changing people's both mindsets and hearts, and they're more easily engaged in that work if they have relationships with other people that make them feel safe to do this. Here's the one I'm going to spend a little more time with. So the political or advocacy frame. So in higher education, so they've done lots of research on these frames, Bowman and Deal, and in education, and this may not be shocking, educators very much come from a human, relations frame, and they believe in supporting human beings. It's the kind of the work that we, do in human development. And then secondly, structural frame, they're very high. So those are the two where there are a lot of leaders who tend to operate from those frameworks. Very few leaders operate from a political or advocacy framework, and this is the reason higher education are extremely political organizations, yet we tend to see politics as a very negative kind of thing, that we see it as more the most, that politics is equal to manipulation, rather than politics can be, so this is the new way I'd like you to think about it, is advocacy. So you imagine if you were working at a nonprofit organization and you wanted to get support for your initiatives, you would be doing advocacy, and that would be political, but you might not see it in the same kind of negative light. And so, this lens is sort of leaders acknowledging that, when we bring human beings into the equation, that organizations are political. They're just not everybody has the same interests, the same ideas, the same viewpoints. And so there are differences among groups along all of these different dimensions. And so the ways to think about that, though, instead of so people therefore are going to try to manipulate each other in that system, is instead to think about, that often people are, the changes they're advocating for are coming from a good and ethical place. And so the work to influence other people can be a very positive thing. So this is about looking at how do I influence other people who may need to be persuaded. So it's about persuasion. It's thinking about power, though, in a more positive way, like going in and mapping power, like who does have influence here, who can get and allocate resources. So you're trying to think about power in the way that it can be deployed in an empowering way. So power can be empowering, not oppressive. So we tend to think manipulation, oppression, rather than like the positive, like empowerment. So that's why I put in the positive politics. The ways that you can create alliances with different groups across campus. The ways that you can have relate or mutual interests. So this is, forming connections and relationships to achieve common ground, bargaining, negotiation, agenda setting. So these are kind of, I want to set out for you some more positive ways to think about politics. And so here, organizations change when change agents are effective in using influence and power strategies. So that's what some of the goals are. So if we were to think about a diversity and inclusion initiative, what are some of the ways that you might use a more political or advocacy lens? Thank you.
You probably could also use comparison, like our competitors have this percentage.
Yes. Yep.
And that you kind of start to build some pressure there.
Yep.
And comparison.
Yeah, no, comparison is a great way. Sort of peer influence is an incredibly powerful and motivating factor in higher education. That's great. Yes. So persuading them about, here is some guidance that can help us in moving forward. So that's a great other example. That is great. So one of the examples I've seen on many campuses of doing that is a lot of people are doing work in the environment or ecology. Well, lo and behold, who are the communities? So that tend to have a lot of the environmental waste are a lot of the communities of color, a lot of the low-income groups. So they found this kind of mutual alignment and interest between those who are doing the environmental work and the diversity and inclusion work. So there's oftentimes these ways you can have these synergies of, wait, we have a lot of mutual interests and we can both move this agenda forward. That's a great example. There are tons of these like networks that you can set up. How do you find some key champions around campus that a lot of times we get isolated in our unit or division and don't realize there are all sorts of other champions or allies that we could have across campus. So I really suggest, yes. Yeah, so on college campuses, there are a lot of informal leaders. There might be a faculty member in a particular department who, if they Like, so they have no formal power, but if they were to find your initiative to be, valuable or aligned with their goals, it just, tons of other people follow. So that's oftentimes how you can use the informal, or certain people who, they may not have that kind of set of connections, but they always work behind the scenes a lot, and then if you get them on your side, that they can kind of ripple through a lot of other, like they're a staff member who's just really well networked. Maybe they don't, they don't have a particular position of power, but via their kind of, maybe they've been on the campus 17 years, they're really well networked, and that informal source of power can be one that you can really harness. So those are kind of the example, versus formal power are those who are typically in positions of authority, and they can, be levered as well. You can think about, I often talk about, managing up to like suggest, things. So like a managing up strategy, sort of more with formal power, would be, to just kindly send an article again about some area around diversity and inclusion to somebody who's in your division who you think, that might help them if they kind of read about or became more versant in this. Yes.
I subscribe to a few different news sources, and
Yeah.
every time an article comes along that says exactly what I've been trying
Yes.
to say, I forward it to the people.
Yes, that is fabulous managing up. Like, that's exactly it. So it's not even your source. It's like, look, here's these other authoritative sources. They're saying it kind of like the gentleman's example over here of here's this, or the our peers. Like, there's all these outside sources, many that can be levered to communicate our messages in new and different ways for us. Oh, great examples. Thank you. And then lastly, and the least tangible, and then again, often sometimes, again, more difficult for leaders to think about and deploy, is the symbolic frame. And this is what's ironic about this. Again, just like we're really political organizations, but we tend to try to pretend we aren't. We are incredibly symbolic organizations, right? Everything we do, from our mascots to all of our rituals and ceremonies to all of our buildings. But yet when we lead, we often don't lead with that, all that kind of wonderful inspiration and symbolism that it gives the meaning. I mean, people choose to work on colleges and universities and forego working in other places because they're so excited about our values and our mission and the kind of work that goes on and working with students. And like, we don't capitalize on all of that excitement and the meaning that it has for getting people excited about maybe a change initiative that we would like them to engage in. So this symbolic frame is really, really powerful because, this kind of value and meaning system, it is what is driving so much of the work we do. It's just not, it's not visible. And so because, the values we hold, like, so every time I go, it's easier for me because I go to new campuses, but all the time, and we're all situated, but I'll go and I'll see some value system that's really exciting about a campus. So I was talking earlier about how I visited George Mason and University, and they just have all this excitement around interdisciplinarity and being kind of innovative in some of the work that they've done, and producing, so they're like, oh, we've done all this work on energy and sustainability, but it gives them a kind of an excitement, right? And so what they've learned to do, though, is leverage what is exciting to people on campus, what gets them up and going in the morning that we tend to forget about, but we can attach the change initiative we had to some of those exciting values that exist. Every campus, we have our just existing kind of symbolic system in operation, but we all have some kind of unique things that are a part of the campus, something about its mission that brings an excitement. And the more that we can bring that in to our changes, the more likely people are to want to participate. So change leaders in this process, it's more about, they're really good at helping people to see the shared mission and values, right? They're talking about and getting people excited around mission and values. They're often really good storytellers, and coming to University of Southern California, where I'm at, the president that we had at the time, Steve Sample, he was this amazing storyteller about the Trojan family. And it just became this, like, everybody knew about the Trojan family. no matter if they hadn't gone to USC in 50 years, like his like power of telling that story was absolutely, just, it was wrapped. I mean, people just became wrapped in the idea no matter where he presented. So he just had that really good storytelling ability that made people want to be a part of it. He did the same for our community engagement work. So we were doing a lot of work to be better members of our local community. And we had not been. We had put up gigantic walls that were like separating us. And he wanted to bring down those walls and really have us engaging with the community again. And he got out in the community, was really able to bring them back into it, even though they could have felt really wounded by this, and really able to energize the campus community around it. But he did that through going out and talking to people, talking to staff members and hearing what did they really care about in terms of engaging the community, what was meaningful to them. So he learned about what was meaningful to other people. He integrated that into his stories. He made connections. So the symbolic frame is, really, a leader who can spend time thinking through how do beliefs and values drive the work that we're doing, the meaning-making process. And change then happens, right, as change agents utilize cultural strategies. So it's how do they use the storytelling, how do they use the shared vision, how do they go about articulating and establishing new values. So they're really good at this kind of work. Oh, I want to go back. So as we think about diversity and inclusion work, and again, we can open up to any, what kind of symbolic strategies? Yeah. So the last two, I'll tell you, they're harder. We had fewer examples. This is very sort of typical of, when Bowman and Deal surveyed higher education leaders, is like, we really are strong in human relations for the most part, pretty good on structural, don't really utilize political or symbolic strategies in ways that we could to really advance change. And so I would ask you to sort of think about, as you are working to be a change agent, sort of how could I utilize some of these other strategies that I may not be, and how might they help me moving forward? So you can link to take the survey. So I was going to just give you a link that you could go and take it, and you can take it anytime. So it's anyways, we can just follow up with it. And so what that survey has done when they've kind of amalgamated is they found that people tend to rely, as I've mentioned, on one or two of the frames. They don't tend to score as highly, and so that's why I'm going to try to press all of you to think about. Once you get a chance to kind of take the survey, how might you either again build or expand your multi-frame thinking, or how might you connect with other people to do that kind of more multi-frame work. So we'll get you the handout.
We'll get into that.
No problem. So I'm going to just return back to this USC example though again, so you can see also the way that the different multiple frames were used in this example to kind of advance it. So we talked about sort of starting as a conversation among faculty about their concerns. So that's sort of that HRs, they were coming together about saying, we've got this shared concern, we've got this shared concern. They then asked to create a subcommittee, which is very much, again, this structural strategy. They were discovered that it was considered a shadow setup by some, and so that was more of a political approach. So if they hadn't been able to navigate that political challenge, they would have been stuck there, but they were able and savvy to do that. Then again, they requested, the new leadership and a different charge, so they were working from a structural frame and getting the new charge, but then they identified they needed a new person. Again, sort of the person there was shaping or affecting the change. They conducted that survey of needs, which is, from the HR lens. The data was viewed differently by school and department. They hadn't anticipated that. Again, that's political, like that people have different interests that they're coming to the change with. They proposed those handbook changes. Again, that was a structural change, but it hit the rapids. Then they started to understand why that handbook change was not well received, and that was based on the culture being very decentralized, so as they were starting to do more sort of cultural exploration. And then they capitalized on the competition, which was again a part of the culture. So it was this multi-frame thinking that helped them to get through the process. So I'm trying to have you see how those frames were then operating in that specific example. So once you get a chance to take the survey, these are some of the kinds of questions, and we'll send you out the PowerPoint to just kind of reflect on what frames are your strengths and which might need enhancing, so that you can do that afterwards. So before I start this, any questions then about, we sort of covered the landscape of how to think about the change process differently with this river metaphor. And we've talked about kind of expanding your change agent skills to use more of this multi-frame leadership. So anything anybody wants to add or comment on?
I just have one question. Are you using reframing leadership? Is that the Bowman Deal citation?
Yep.
Do you think that book is useful if you're teaching leadership, but not specifically for people who are going to apply it in higher ed?
Oh yeah, because their book is written with no higher education audience in mind. It's a broad book on organizational theory and organizational behavior. They give examples from every sector.
Okay.
They do hospitals, government, business, and education. So because they are situated in education, they've done a lot of research and work in that as well, but it's cross. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I just want to make a quick comment. So we're in the age of assessment.
Yes.
And I think oftentimes assessment is viewed as this strategic planning or structural or just like process-based. And I've noticed in being able to kind of change the role of assessment to be more storytelling.
Yep.
And that to be less punitive or intimidating to units and having it more like tell your story.
Yeah.
Are you seeing that in other organizations, or how is the role of assessment through these frames being viewed?
So two things. So one is I actually teach every year at the Assessment Leadership Academy for WASC. So that's for the Western Association of Colleges and Universities. So it's one of the accrediting bodies. And they've set up a leadership academy for people who do assessment work. And one of the things that I do with them is help them to think about how can they rethink the work of assessment to not be structural, to have it be inquiry, have it be a part of, because they recognize, that they're not going to be effective on their campuses if they're just seen as this kind of bureaucratic requirement. And so we talk about, the heart of assessment as work is it's supposed to be inquiry and reflection. And how do they think about it within that lens? And then we do talk about the Bowman and Deal, about when they're working with different units and when they're trying to engage people, how they engage them through the inspiration of why did you come, you come here to be an educator. How does assessment fit into your role as being an educator, not as a bureaucratic responsibility, right? Or how do you talk about the role of assessment in sort of collegial improvement? Like you find out through assessment that like courses like this course, Biology 100 versus, going into biology, the Biology, 102, everyone's failing out, something's wrong with Biology 100. I found this in the assessment data. You want to improve, like that. So it's about the educational improvement. So we do both. We talk about how do you reframe what even the work of assessment is, but also then how do you deploy it as a change agent in ways, because they're the way that even they go about changes, it tends to be like, you need to do assessment because it's an institutional mandate or priority. No one's excited about that, right? So that doesn't bring people in. So that's exactly what we do. We talk about like, how do you build on people's inspiration for why they came here and how assessment is tied to that and things like that. Thank you for that question. Anything else around, like as you're trying to think about being a change agent in any way, shape, or form? All right, we'll have time for questions at the end. We got the train going by. I don't get to hear that every day at USC. You all might get to. All right, so I want to talk also about buy-in, because it is one of those kind of one of the most challenging areas in change. So, I love this book. It's got such a great title too, Immunity to Change. Has anybody read it? Okay, you have, of course. So, this is a really fun book that helps to understand some of the challenges around buy-in. And I found it, in all my work that I've been doing around change, I found this really important quality of the role of sense-making to help in buy-in. And then I've been able to tie sense-making to some of the work in immunity to change. So Keegan's work started looking at individuals who said, I'm really committed to changing. So he wasn't even looking at people who were resistant to change. He's looking at people who said, I am so excited to do this thing, but then it never happened. And then he took that same work and moved it into organizations. So organizations that were committed to particular priorities, but why was it that they weren't going in that direction that they had very much committed to? Because this is even more troubling to understand than, resistance to change. We know that we can try to sort of understand why somebody's resistant, but this is like, why are people and organizations committed to changes, but then they don't do it? So, and this, ties in very much to some of the work that some of the advanced grants have gotten in terms of the implicit bias, which is slightly different. This is about unconscious competing values. So, so he would say one of his classic examples is the person says, I want to stop smoking. I don't want to smoke anymore, but unconsciously, they're really committed to after I smoke that cigarette, I feel so relaxed, and I just love that. But they're still tied to that, but they're not recognizing the other thing that is of value to them that they can't sort of release. And his work is about how do you flesh out, and when he talks at the organizational level, it's about how do you flesh out these unconscious competing assumptions that are preventing groups from doing work. So he talks about the importance of surveys and focus groups and engagement sort of strategies that would help for us as a campus, but for him, organizations in changing. So a classic example of when I was working on a STEM reform initiative, and all these individuals in the math department knew that there were these great new pedagogical strategies. They were going to do this math in context. It was all fantastic, and everybody was bought in, but it wasn't happening. And so finally, someone in the room said, if we take this on, this also means we have to admit we've been teaching badly for the past 30 years. And it was like this whole sigh of oh, that's it. Nobody wanted to sort of engage that. So it was preventing people from moving forward. And so sometimes it's just getting out there. And then that was able to it sort of just diffuse something for the whole group, and they were able to move past what they hadn't been able to. So these are some of the unconscious competing values that I've seen come up on different projects or work that I've done that prevent people. So active learning will challenge my expertise. Diversity will compromise excellence. Focusing on teaching will compromise my research. Supporting student safety around hate speech will compromise academic freedom. Attention to student success will compromise other institutional goals. Or off-campus political engagement will compromise our objectivity and neutral orientation. So these are, things that roll around in people's heads that prevent them then from moving towards a particular change initiative. So the work that I've done on sense-making both helps address this kind of major challenge that Keegan saw repeatedly in 50 years of studies about making conscious some of these unconscious values that are preventing people from moving forward. But I've also seen the sense-making do other kinds of things that build on his work, like helping surface fears and emotions that exist around a change, allowing people to understand the change. So sometimes people, literally, this is one of the ones with active learning, they'll say, I really want to do it, But I've read every book and article, and I really don't understand what it is still. Like they're like, just don't understand what it is. And the sense making is about how we actually provide. So we recognize that we actually have to run simulations for people to go in and see what active learning is. That the sense making is about like a way that people can learn more about the change, and that sometimes it's because they've got some kind of unconscious value that they've got to work through, or they some kind of fear. But sometimes people literally do not know what the thing is that you're asking them to do, and that we're not providing them entry points to understand it in a way that's going to make it, something that they can do. So a sense making allows time for learning and processing the change. So for understanding these unconscious values, to understand the fears and emotions, and then allow time for learning. So sense making is all these different kinds of activities that you can do at the beginning of a change that then helps to get that buy-in. Because again, sometimes I don't buy in because I don't even know why I'm not buying in, right? That's the unconscious. Sometimes I'm afraid, I have fears, I have emotions. And sometimes I'm just not really sure what it is you want me to do. So sense making kind of addresses all of these gamut of things that prevent it. And so the ones these are some of the examples, not all of them, from my research. The outside circle, I call them, are the easier to kind of start up, and the ones in the center are kind of longer term, more intensive kinds of sense-making vehicles. So doing something like a holding focus group. So like if you're starting up a change and you really want to understand how do people feel about it, like bringing people together to have focus groups. Many of the campuses that I've worked with send people off to other campuses on field trips. So they'll send teams that say, okay, we're going to really do a new community engagement initiative. Why don't you go to these other campuses that do that really well, and then come back and help us to understand? Because sometimes you don't have the information there to do it well, and going out and seeing another model really helps with that. You can also do that by bringing in outside speakers who then talk about and bring in some of the new perspectives. That can also happen by like a key concept paper that gets written for the campus. So if it's this community engagement initiative, you can have various people on campus that try to come together and put it in words that are really specific to this context. You can have, like, in general, people write about community engagement, but what would it really mean for this campus? And kind of like a concept paper that really distills that out for the campus. Having brown bag lunches where people come together, over time to talk about what will it mean for us to do community engagement. Professional development you all are probably really familiar with, but that turns out to be really helpful in terms of helping people work through sense making. I'm just going to mention the one in the middle, like professional learning communities, because those have really taken off on many campuses as a way that people come together. So this can be staff members or faculty members or mixed groups who read in common something together or talk about their practice. So sometimes it's faculty saying, I'm going to implement service learning, and they're going to come together and actually talk about that practice over a year. So they commit to like a year of being together, learning together, doing inquiry together. So these different sense-making vehicles get people that opportunity to have, and you don't do just kind of one of these, it's kind of like multiples of these together help the sense-making. So you're pulling them multiple times that people are being hit by different ways, and it might reach one person through the brown bag lunch and a different person through the outside speaker. Like, you never know, like, sort of you're throwing a lot, I call it like spaghetti at the wall, and different things are going to hit different people in different ways.
I think we have some fear, probably not unreasonable in the state, that the legislature is not really interested in anything to do with anti-racism. And so I think there's an underlying, this isn't the structure of the university
Right.
so much as it's the funding structure on
Yeah.
which the university rests. And the cultural climate here has a long history of racism and attempting to actually exclude black people from
Yeah.
the state,
Yeah.
Oregon. And so I think that's a harder one for us to crack, because I think our sense is people are always looking up as if funding is going to be challenged, and people are also looking out to the community as if, and I think they're probably incorrect, but as if that's the source of the exclusion, and they're being responsive to values.
No, that's a great point of like, what if it's not trying to get, the buy-in isn't because of something internal to individuals or groups, but is external. Has anybody got, it's a really interesting point. I'm doing a case study at the University of Missouri, and this is very relevant there because the legislature did actually take away money. And so we are working on helping them to understand and navigate that environment. Yeah.
You know, another example, whenever you're really pushing to implement change and you're kind of making some people uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Other people, for fear of harming their own future opportunities on campus, won't push when sometimes push is what's needed to implement change.
Yeah.
So, and that's not unique to this institution, it's everywhere, you know.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm thinking, you know, obviously from a staff perspective where there is no tenure.
Right.
So either you get to a certain point, and then I think sometimes out of fear of harming personal opportunity,
Yeah.
people backtrack a little bit.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sometimes just need to keep pushing forward.
Yeah, yeah, no, and it is hard when, you know, well, particularly if, because I'm thinking again, University of Missouri, when there are people who did get fired because they act out. So they have had a lot of people who got fired who tried to support the student protesters at the time who were trying to stand up against the racist behavior, right? So and those staff members. And so it's a really, I cannot say this is an easy thing because it's super challenging, and one of the things we're trying to help sort out is they've got new leadership in now, so I mean, it's
The president hit his.
yeah, well, president was,
in his car.
yeah, it was like, yes, well, and the students eventually, forced out the president, and it wasn't until way too late. But even as you have new leadership, those fears don't go away. So even if you have like something in the past where this has happened, and I don't have easy answers for either of those 2 points, because it is like, it has been, essentially what they've done to do this is build the argument, and I've been working with them, of like how supporting inclusion and diversity does help. The thing they really care about is the state economy, and they've partnered with businesses that have a very pro-diversity stance. So they've had to work, so the best workaround I can tell you is we've had is working with business, working with industry, working with these external groups that say, no, we want the campus to be doing this, and use these more powerful groups to lever with the legislature, because that is, they were too vulnerable, and they had already been threatened by that. So that is the strategy that's underplaying and seems to be working. It is still fairly soon in being deployed, so they've been working on this for about a year and a half, but it has, like, the money has come back, and the legislature seems to not be punitive anymore. But yeah, they're really politically difficult and sensitive issues, and that was a big one. But others, yeah, I mean, these are, yeah.
So you're writing about that now?
Yeah, so we have a report that's out. It's called Speaking Truth to Power, and it is a case study of the first 2 years afterwards. We're just completing the second one. It'll be out in January. It's through the American Council on Education, and I can also send that around to anybody. But it's all the lessons about it's about navigating racial crises, recovering from racial crises, trauma inflicted during racial crises that most campuses, if they've had racial incidents, have to deal with. It's it's very timely because our social political climate is not very favorable, is making the racial instances much more common on campuses. And so that was, they opened up to us because they wanted to be able to have those lessons come out to others in higher ed, and because they saw that this is just going to become, unfortunately, more prevalent in these years. So I'm happy to share that with anybody who would be interested. Yeah. Yeah.
So I just wanted to really appreciate this point, because I was driven to Keegan and Leahy interested in this question about why don't people change, and there is this misconception that somehow by raising awareness
Yeah.
And so looking at what those hidden commitments are, surfacing them can be a little problematic. First, people don't want to say that's what it is.
Right.
So, one of the things is we do change agent work, at least for the people here who have taken our class and will take
Yeah.
the class in the future. When we think about what those hidden commitments are, putting those out on the table
Yep.
to talk about what that means. It doesn't mean we'll solve it, but at least to talk about the fact that there are certain people who are well positioned to have an effect.
Yeah.
Typically, as you talk about
Yeah.
the very powerful people on campus who are committed to these issues, who are well positioned. You may not necessarily be that person, right? And so sometimes we understand that the hidden commitments that we have are tied to, I am not a tenured faculty member.
Yeah.
I am still trying to, but unearthing that is important work. And one of the things that inspired me in your work was you acknowledged it as opposed to just acting like it was going to go from awareness, now people will suddenly do it.
Right.
No, you talk about who and how important these power differentials are. How do you share power as someone in a really powerful position? How do you use yours? Because otherwise it can be really frustrating.
Yeah.
People are not prepared to talk about that part, the hidden commitments.
Yeah, and I think one of the exciting things that I did hear as we were talking over lunch, though, is your campus, as opposed to many others that I've been on, has started having some really good facilitated dialogues and the kind of strengths around that will be really important for this kind of work, because it is, I mean, the sense-making vehicles are like they're opportunities for those conversations to happen, but the facilitation around those conversations is also really important, right? So having strengths around, like, when you bring people together and they're going to talk about a change and maybe why, again, like when we sat around with the math department and we're kind of brainstorming, like, with, what's going on here, like why are we not moving forward to kind of like push and to facilitate? And we didn't have a particular facilitator in that dialogue, but we had a number of, a trained facilitator, but we had a number of people who had pretty decent facilitation skills in the room. So you don't always have to have, say, a trained facilitator, but it helps to have some people have good, skills in helping people have somewhat difficult conversations and allowing these things to come out. And then, in different projects I've been in, and it rolls in different ways. So I can't tell you like exactly what the next step is after you help develop the awareness or trying to get people to process it, because it moves in so many organic directions after that's happened. But I did want to give you an example of like how it played out on a particular campus that may kind of walk through like seeing both the immunity to change, the sense-making buy-in, and kind of to culture change piece. But tell me how and if this gets added. So, is everybody familiar with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County? So some of you may be familiar that they've instituted something called the Meyerhoff Scholars Program, and it's a really amazing program that works with first-generation low-income and students of color, and they've had probably the most success in the country in educating a large number of students. Like their retention rates are really high. They have incredible success rates, getting them all in. They all end up going into PhD programs. I mean, they've had phenomenal success with this. But they didn't start out, with this program being, easily implemented. And when the president first was there, he recognized that they did a survey of the faculty and staff about views of students' performance, and approaches to teaching, and really found out there were some really deficit views around student performance. And there were a lot of views about teaching that were not very particularly oriented towards learning, if you will, like the kind of the views of what the teaching practices were not necessarily ones that were aligned with anything we know are good teaching practices, and not oriented, again, it was more about delivery of content. And then they followed up with some focus groups to kind of understand this, because he knew that if he was going to put in this program that was going to try to help first generation, low income, and underserved minorities, that if the faculty kind of views around student performance might be important to understand and their practices. And some of those underlying values would need to be challenged and talked about. And also tried to introduce then, articulate a new set of values. So he was going in with a framework of inclusive excellence. And some of you may be familiar with that. Is anybody familiar with inclusive excellence framework? So it's a framework from the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and it's looking at very much the way that it takes a much more asset-based view of students, and looks at how our efforts at diversity and inclusion are not in competition with our efforts to be excellent, and so that the two very much can come together as values. So he then started to he realized there were going to be some problematic values that would need to be challenged, and some practices and teaching that would need to be explored. And then looking also just at the policies and practices that were in place in terms of student support, what were some of the policies around advising or tutoring, and just to kind of look at some of the things that were there. And then he formed teams to look at this data to kind of explore, so how are we going to move forward? So there was this exploration of let's gather up and understand. So started with, as we say, some of this data and organizational learning practices. So really just how do we understand the baseline of where we're at? And then really deeply involved all campus stakeholders in a review of this data. So it was a really broad communications strategy. And then he started really trying to, in parallel, work to implement this new value system. So having these public presentations about inclusive excellence, but also had, at that time, was understanding it and describing, in smaller group settings, challenging some of the deficit views about students and about teaching not being as connected to learning. So, and then he set up these faculty learning communities and said, okay, let's really talk about how do students best learn. So setting up, learning communities to investigate their own teaching practices. So setting up those faculty learning communities, provided professional development for staff around how do we really rethink the advising and support structures that we have. Are these how is the peer culture supportive or not of the students? So they were really kind of working with the staff to rethink the practices that they were engaged with. So each group went through kind of a different kind of learning, whether it was a professional development or a professional learning community, where they were going to rethink deeply their practice and have an opportunity to talk about it and rethink it. Set up cross-departmental teams about particular areas, like we don't have good mentoring structures here. How do we work, both faculty, staff, students, to rethink mentoring at all those levels? They should have mentors that are, student mentors, like senior class people, as well as faculty members. So they were having these cross-departmental teams and groups that would address that challenge of mentoring. So they kept taking on each of those areas and working on them in an inquiry-based way to rethink their practices, to do things differently, because he knew, given the existing sort of values and mindsets from before, that wasn't going to happen, the aspiration that he had. So he was, in the end, he was able to get all these introductory courses that were completely redesigned and taught differently. The faculty were much more, they had again, part of the professional learning communities was to talk about accessibility cues. How do they present themselves as much more accessible to students so they could feel more efficacious? And then implemented this really extensive mentoring process, these new study groups and peer support. So all of this was supported through these different sense-making vehicles. So I thought I'll just stop there as kind of an example of thinking through now the kind of the role in the change process of sense making, to see if there's any kind of questions, because we're pretty much towards the end at this point, and I know we're all getting tired. It's toward the end of the day, but Just anything, any comments about like thinking through as you're kind of our own role in sort of facilitating people's opportunities, again, to understand the change. We started this out, like sense-making is all about how do we get people to think about like fears or emotions they might have about the change, think about unconscious values, but also think about ways that they may just not understand what the work is. So maybe, some people on this campus, they really just didn't understand what teaching in a way that really promoted learning looked like. That wasn't something that they knew at that time. Yeah.
Well, so I have a lot of questions about it, but one of the very difficult things in talking about sense making is that it can sound, it could come across as very insulting. Like if you're working with
that's great.
faculty and you're
Yeah.
kind of suggesting that there are these things they don't know, but they don't know that they don't know those things.
Yeah.
And I do wonder, this is Freeman Dabrowski's.
Yep.
Does it take the president of the university to be able to do that in a way that the process is insulting? I mean, this is like the epitome of the examples, right? But
Right.
How do you do it if it?
Because it happens at all. Yeah, I've worked with campuses that are doing it at in a department or in a unit. So it doesn't have to be this. This is just where you can see all the different kind of sense-making activities were happening. Because if you're doing it at a local unit, you probably need less kind of intensive sense-making, vehicles and opportunities, and if the change is not as massive, right? But how do you make it not sound insulting? So I have heard lots of different strategies. So one of so on one end is I've been to many campuses where they said, well, we don't call anything faculty development because that sounds that term is there's a real turn off. So that I found different campuses how they do it. So, but if we say we're doing a workshop to help you enhance your ability to get grants and something else. So they call it something else, and then it happens to lean in on, did you know the National Science Foundation is really interested also in quality education? This is how they think about it. And they switch out, they are very careful about terminology that they use in even what they call sessions, or they try to I'm trying to think of I usually see less of this, although you can tell me with staff, there doesn't tend to be as much of a rub with staff feeling on many campuses that they wouldn't want to be a part of something that would improve their practice. But I don't know, you may have had that. So usually it's with faculty that I've heard it, and campuses just have used different kinds of strategies, and I don't know if any of you have some of them that you've shared here with faculty, because I imagine you've worked on them, and I don't know what the culture is like here around that as well. Professional learning communities, in my experience, have caught on because they're faculty driven. They're faculty up, so that's why I brought that one up as it is not considered insulting. It was the faculty here who also drove the creation of it, so he helped to understand and define some of the problem, but those groups, so if I go back and talk about the groups, so he had all these campus stakeholders in there, so they helped develop the groups and solutions. He just collected a lot of the data and then got them to come up with some solutions. So it doesn't seem, if you will, insulting when it's the campus community that's came up with the idea that we need these groups to talk about improving teaching and introductory courses. So part of it is the mode you get into it at. Some campuses still you can't call it that thing, so there's, but on most campuses, if you get the faculty excited and driven about creating those, then it overrides that concern. Does that make sense?
I think it does, and maybe in my head, and I know there are lots of people
Yeah.
who are experts at this, at getting people to move in a direction that doesn't make it feel insulting. But when it's working on issues of racism,
Yeah.
Chris mentioned before,
Yeah.
or sexism, or homophobia, or whatever, that's where it gets really difficult.
Yeah. Well, so I don't have it here, but I mean, you know, that's where, but advance has been very good. I mean, I'm not specifically, hadn't made this presentation about the advanced strategies, but I mean, I think where I have derived a lot of exciting strategies is from the advanced program across the various campuses have come up with ways about how do we draw in people to these difficult conversations about implicit bias. So I know you have good resource specifically about that area in the advanced community. I mean, I think of, and have you all had here like the advanced theater troupe?
We've had theater adults that
Yeah.
for chairs. I think it was
Yeah.
the chairs leadership, but they're coming back in October to do graduate stuff.
So that's one of, at least I have found that the campuses that I've been on where, so they, and this may be the one you did, where the theater troupe acts out like a hiring situation where the bias is happening, and then the whole group gets to process like what was happening there, what would you have done differently? I mean, those are great. The theater troupe examples is one of my, you know, a really powerful sort of sense-making one, because I've seen as chairs, so I went and did some observation evaluation of the UC system had like 5 campuses that were a part of an advanced grant. And talking to the chairs who had participated in that afterwards, talking about how transformative it was for them, they said like, when I'm sitting in a real hiring committee, I'm just thinking about like, I'm trying to run the meeting, and I can't even, I probably don't notice if implicit bias is going on because I'm so in my process of running the meeting, but then it was so apparent there and I learned so much, and it really has made, you know, it changed my mindset about it, right? So it was a way to teach about it without, you know, talking about it. And you know, so for me, that is an example of getting at some of these hard issues in a way that didn't feel threatening. Like none of the people who attended sort of the theater, they might have been a little nervous at first, but then they were so engrossed. I mean, it is like really powerful how engrossed all these department chairs were in trying to kind of role play and think through. And then some of them got thrown in to have to be the department chair when that was playing out. I mean, it's just really powerful, and that was life transferring for them. They're like, you know, I don't think about any meeting now in the same way because of going through that training. So, and so I think that, you know, the group that has already, if you will, made sense and is kind of on board, should be, in any change process, it's really important to get some, I'll call it like initial wins where things are happening so people continue to feel excited, things are moving forward. So you move with those who are with you, right? But then you have to recognize, wait, there's a lot, you know, don't forget, because what happened traditionally, a lot of leadership efforts I've seen is everybody, they just go with the small group that is getting it, and they just start running ahead and they leave everybody behind, right? And so the sense-making is about not forgetting that group, going, okay, well, we've got to get some small wins out here. We got to start having people believe, because there's also, I do some work on readiness for change. So if people don't believe that you can actually execute the change, like anything's going to happen, they also don't want to buy in. So there's other kinds of things that buy in. So I may not buy in. I might totally really believe in diversity and inclusion. I just don't think you guys can pull it off. So like, I don't want to waste my time. I got plenty to do over here, right? You know, so like if I don't think it's really going to go anywhere, there are a lot of people kind of sitting on the fence. That's not because they don't believe in the work. They just don't believe you can be efficacious. So part of like making them believe in it is seeing some things happen, right? So having some people are out in front making some incremental changes. But that group has to keep remembering all these people are here who have a variety of reasons or haven't bought in yet, don't understand, and that you keep attentive to kind of going back. So you're like over here moving forward, but you're like circling back, and you have to like in a kind of constant manner be circling back. So you've got to do both at the same time. So that's a great point, because like sometimes we're thinking here or here, and we have to parallel process those. They both got to be happening.
I think it's important to celebrate the victories that you do get.
Yes. Yep.
The battles that you win, you have to remember that. And
Absolutely.
Like you said, you know, circle back around, and you have to keep.
No, that's great. Great point. Yeah, and all of my work on transformation, the celebrating is really important, because that's part of that symbolic leadership of like making sure things are honored, and the kind of even recognitions, awards, all of that is that symbolic sort of that people go, okay, yes, it's, you know, like it makes people feel, excited about and acknowledged in the work that's going on. Yeah.
Just to tack on those victories, when you have somebody who suddenly has an epiphany that they didn't realize
Yeah.
before, bringing them in to talk to the people who haven't yet had the epiphany.
Yes.
Seems
Yes.
to be really.
Is really powerful. Yeah, that is part of this. That is a great symbolic strategy. We talk about that. It's like to bring in, those who've like had a values shift, right? If you will. So it's like people can see it better in somebody else who may have been more like them, right? Like those who have always felt this way, feel it's harder for other people sometimes to connect to their experience. It's kind of the space I wanted to take you through was kind of thinking through change processes differently, getting to be a multi-frame leader, and then kind of enhancing some of your buy-in strategies. So I wanted to start there and intrigue you to maybe want to read or think more about change. Hence some of the, the suggested reading, some of the things I talked about. And like I said, those of you who are also interested in some of the work around this, some of the psychological work around barriers to change, Keegan's work is really helpful around immunity to change. Well, thank you all.
Share your new paper with us.
I'm going to share about the University of Missouri work, which is really, really interesting, work. So I highly recommend it to you. But thank you all. It's so great to meet everybody and spend some time with you.